It's a pleasure to have him here, and I turn it over to you, Deray.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm super pumped for the questions and the pushes. I won't take up too much time just talking at you, but started Pod Save the People in 2016, I think. We were the second podcast on the Cricket Network. You might be familiar with Pod Save America, which is the flagship podcast on the network. And Favreau called me like, Deray, we should do a podcast. And I was like, let's do it. But I didn't want it to just be me. So it's always been a panel podcast. It is three of us now. It was four of us for many years, and we've gotten to do a lot of cool stuff. We've done in-person tours, and we've gotten awards and all that stuff. But at the very beginning, Favreau asked me, like, what do you want to be true about the podcast if it's successful? And I was like, and we're probably 300-ish episodes or something like that. I don't know. It's been a long time. But uh, what I said was the moment I'll know that I nailed it is when the podcast gets used as a piece of a curriculum in a classroom. Like that will be when I like know I figured it out. And I remember the first time I got an email from a teacher that was like, "We use the podcast," and I was like, "This is really cool." But I used to teach sixth grade math. Sixth grade is a great grade to teach. Seventh grade is puberty. Eighth grade is attitude. But sixth grade is still like joy, and they could do really hard math. I taught in East New York, Brooklyn. And because of that, I'm going to start with the little pop quiz. So if you can use the chat for this, that would be great. Let me get to the slideshow. Okay, so my podcast obviously is about race, justice, the intersection of both, and activism. My activism is around mass incarceration and police. If you can put in the chat what you believe the answer to this question is. So, who incarcerates the most people? The federal government, states, or cities? And if you can just put, I think you can use the chat. Nancy told me you can. Okay, here we go. So I see some rolling in. This is for the US. Yes, Haley. Thank you for the push. A, C, okay. Anybody else? There are only three questions, I promise. Um, B, okay. Okay, well, let me show you the answer. Oh, wait, there was one more that came in that I missed. A or C. So not the federal government. Afraid. Okay. So here is the answer. I'll give you a second to look at it and then I'll voice over. States incarcerate way more people than everybody else. The federal government incarcerates so few people that you can let every single person out of federal custody and it won't change the mass part of mass incarceration. If you look at drugs is interesting because the war on drugs is such a popular conversation. And you could let every single person out of incarceration for drugs and still it won't change the mass part of mass incarceration. The reason I start here is that the storytelling around incarceration matters a ton. That when we show people this data, this is not what people believe is true, and the fact that this is not what people believe is true actually makes the activism in real life really hard. The storytelling is a huge part of how the activism works in practice. Second question. It says pop quiz number one, but it's really the second question. So, what percentage of people are in a private prison? A private prison is a prison run by a company and not the government. So I see one vote for C. C. Yep, the percent of all people incarcerated. Yep, Keith. Okay. A couple more people. Okay. So the answer to this is actually A. It's a little bit less than 8%. It's like 7.5% of people incarcerated are in a private prison. The reason why most people think it's really high is that there was storytelling in Hollywood about a decade ago about private prisons. And the storytelling became a huge deal for the way people thought about incarceration. The reality is that private prisons are a very small percentage of the people incarcerated. Now, most prisons and jails Do have some privatized services in them, which is a different problem we need to solve. But in terms of the facility itself being privatized, actually really low. And this is not insignificant. The reason why it matters is that when we go into communities and work with legislators, if people think that everybody's in a private prison, then they de facto let the government off the hook. They no longer are upset with the governor. They're no longer upset with the mayor. They sort of just abdicate that because they're like, oh, it's a company. And it's like, no, no, this is actually like the people you voted for are running this facility and letting it be a nightmare. But again, I say this too because the storytelling around this is so intense and wrong that it shapes the way people think about it in practice when we organize in community. And the third one is this question. So you know what theft is, and a felony is a sentence. A felony is something that'll get you incarcerated for more than a year. A misdemeanor is incarcerated for less than a year. So this question is, in New Jersey today, if you steal over which amount, is it a felony? Which means that you can get incarcerated for more than a year. One of these numbers is correct. The answer is the answer was A, it's $200. So this was set in 1978. If you steal over $200 in New Jersey, you can get up to 18 months in prison and a fine of $10,000. We called one of the senators, U.S. senators from New Jersey. We called the governor's office in New Jersey, and we asked them about this. And the governor's office literally said to me on the phone that it was too political to try and change this amount in an election cycle. And we were like, well, $200 is really low. This is crazy. But this is the last part of the quiz. The reason I talk about this here is that this is also a function of storytelling. When we poll on this issue, when we tell people this, they think it's crazy. They're like, who knew, blah, blah, blah. Very few people know that it's $200 unless they get charged. And almost none of the legislators knew, and the people charged didn't know that this amount was set in 1978. When we polled on this, people think that that is crazy, that it is this low, that it was set this late. The average amount across the country is $1,000, which is good, and $2,500 is the highest, and that is Texas, which is interesting. But I say this because the storytelling actually matters a ton. That if we give people information, they make different choices, and how we help people think about the things that they already experience in the world matters a ton. The reason why I talk about felony theft is that you've probably seen those videos of people it's like stealing at the Gucci store, stuff like that. You've heard about retail theft or people closing CVS's because people are stealing and blah, blah, blah. And the reality is that that is not necessarily true. That is a different crime, but that shapes the way people think about it. And most people in community don't realize that people are getting long sentences for stealing an iPhone, a pair of tennis shoes, a microwave, a TV. $200 is a really, really low threshold. But I'm trying to make the point that when I think about podcasting for activism versus podcasting for just sort of news, I am trying to help people understand things that they didn't understand before and understand them a little differently. So I'll go through some of the main points I want to talk to. Is that the key advice that I give people who are doing work on activism and podcasting is that we want people to learn and we have a point of view. So I am unapologetic about the idea that I think that we can live in a world beyond policing and that we can live in a world without mass incarceration being the way that it looks today, that people can be held accountable without being in cages. And part of that is like helping people like understand what the system is today. It's those things that I showed you before actually matter a ton to just like teach people. And how do we teach people in a way that is interesting and engaging, helps activate the knowledge that they came to the conversation with, and that we're not afraid to have a point of view, that we don't pretend to be neutral, that people listen to our podcast and have listened to it for a long time because they know what our values are, and we lead from a place with the values. We don't hide from our values. Okay. The next is this idea that how people think about the world shapes the way they act in the world. So we don't take for granted that we actually, so the way we set up our podcast, there are three of us now. We have a text chain where we put in things that we want to talk about, but we make a rule that we actually don't talk about them in the text chain, we talk about them fresh on the podcast. And the reason that matters is that we want people to see us work through an issue in real time too. I sort of know the values that the other people have, so I'm never confused value wise, but I don't know the take they're going to have on it. And the reason why we don't pre plan the conversations is that we want people to feel like they are in a living room or a kitchen or that they're actually experiencing it with us. And I say that because there are other podcasts I listen to where it is clear they came in and sort of knew how they were going to talk about it. And I think that is interesting. I think that's a model. But I do think that we're trying to help people, we're trying to model a way of thinking about the world and a way of engaging in conversation that we hope can shape the way that they act in conversation. But we never take for granted that what people think of the little things, the side comments, the correcting each other if people get off, the like, is that what you really meant? Like we recorded yesterday and somebody said something, I was like, I don't think that's what you meant. And Miles is like, oh, let me do that. Like that actually matters because we're trying to model a set of how to interact with people and people we love and people we sometimes disagree with. That the modeling of it actually matters in the activism space in a way that I'm not convinced it matters in the news space as much. Curation is one of the biggest things we can do on our podcast. We all pick one piece of news we want to talk about, and more than not, it is a piece of news that went unrecognized in the public conversation, and that also includes books. So there's a really good. This interview has not come out yet on the podcast, but there's a book about the racist history of the transportation infrastructure. I thought it was going to be about highways. I already know about highways being racist, but I learned a ton in the sense that like I didn't know that the whether communities have sidewalks or not is about race. I didn't know that in places like Atlanta, when black people moved on blocks, the city would erect barriers and block the streets off. Like there are so many other ways to think about transportation infrastructure that sounds like super boring. But in this interview with this author, I'm like, oh, people actually already have an experience with this. They just don't have the language about it. And part of what we can do is put people to focus on things that they would not otherwise have language for or think were issues. And I do think that is a key part of what the activist space does, is that we help people say, hey, the world is overwhelming and crazy. There are a million things to focus on. What are the 2 or 3 things I should talk about this week? We say that we're more hopeful than optimistic. So hope says it is possible. Optimistic in some ways says it will happen. Like, I believe that this will be the case, whereas hope says I know it can be the case. So we especially in this political moment, we're not Pollyannas about like it's all going to work out, but we are hopeful in the sense that if we figure out a strategy, it is possible to win. And I think that people doom scroll enough. I think the internet is dramatic enough that we didn't want to contribute to the sense of hopelessness, but we also don't want to lead people down a path where they think that like it is inevitable that the world gets better. We like to find this balance that says we think it's possible if people work really hard. And if these things line up. So we try to give advice or like help people think through the world in a way that feels a little more actionable than potentially promising people that it will just get better. This is really important when we started the podcast, is we are intentional about giving people language. So when we process things, we try and say it in a way that we think people can repeat in their living rooms. So when I talk about the police, one of the ways that I talk about the police today is I'll say, do you need a person with a gun to tell a 10-year-old to stop yelling? That'll be a way that I talk about the police in schools, which is different than talking about the school to prison pipeline and da-da-da-da. Because I know that people have like heard me say it that way and they turnkey that language in their own community. Or when people used to press me a lot at the very beginning of the protest, they would say, well, Deray, you saying that there's no reason why the police should be able to kill somebody. And I'm like, well, when should the police be able to kill your daughter or your son or like somebody you love? Like, what is the crime that they could commit that you would be okay with the police killing them? And that, again, is a rhetorical device that I want people to use in their own homes and kitchens and workplaces and communities. So we aren't just processing the world so that people listen to us, but we are trying to intentionally use language and phrases and a way of talking about things that we hope people can turnkey. Because we know that the organizing work is everybody's work, that the only way that we can scale our impact is if people take lessons from what we do and not just sort of like us, but they can turnkey it. This one I could have done a definition slide, but I'll tell you, I never take for granted the definitions. My father raised us. My mother left when I was 3. My father is a huge part of my life, and he doesn't identify as an activist. They both were addicted to drugs. My father started Narcotics Anonymous. My mom didn't. And I say that because my father has always been rooted in a community around recovery, and that has been important to him. But he does not identify as like an activist. He cares about things around addiction, but he wouldn't call himself an activist. But we talk every day, and he supports the work that I do. But we were talking probably a couple months ago, and I was talking about Rikers because at work at Campaign Zero, we have a whole project on Rikers. And as we're talking about it, he's like, "Wow, there's such a crazy prison," and I'm like, "Well, Daddy, Rikers isn't a prison." And he's like, "What do you mean?" And I'm like, this is actually really interesting, is that he didn't realize that prisons and jails aren't the same thing. He thought that prisons and jails were like two very different things, whereas jails are actually where people are before they're incarcerated, and prison is where they go after they're incarcerated or after they're convicted. And he just didn't know. And we never, I use that as an example because we never take for granted that we actually have to define the terms. That making sure that people, one of the first, I think it might have been the first episode of the podcast that was like super popular. We did this whole thing on the difference between Medicare and Medicaid, and most people didn't know like what they were, how it's different, and I didn't know. And there's a part of the curiosity that actually matters that we define the terms. I see there's a question from Alfredo. So giving language to people is not enough if people can't figure out how to produce change. How many people could tell you what the New Deal was about, why FDR was so popular, or what MLK was trying to do by the time he did, or whether BLM incarnates or not that message? Yeah, I think this might be one where we just disagree. I actually think that the storytelling work and the language work is one of the most important things. I'll tell you is, we passed more laws and policies around police and mass incarceration than any activist group in American history. And it is not possible without people coming into the room with a framework for how to think about these things that actually really matters. So I'll give you an example. In places like Maryland, we're trying to make it so that kids don't get automatically charged as adults. And that is sticky because there'll be a kid that does something bad and it changes the news cycle. Rhetorically, what we say in the room is that kids should actually start in juvenile facilities. They should not start in adult prison. From a policy perspective, they are the same thing, but the storytelling actually matters a ton. So it is not giving people language alone, which is why these come as a set. I agree with you on that, but the language piece actually matters a ton. I think about, especially, the work that I do the most is around the police. And we poll, people like the police. They do. Like, the people who identify as activists and so the far left don't always like the police. But in an everyday community, people actually are okay with the police. They just don't want them to kill them and hurt them. I know that. So part of my job is actually to help people think about how to talk about this in a way that can lead to substantive change. So, when we poll, people actually don't like being lied to. They don't like the police lying to them. They don't like the idea that the police are not accountable to anybody. Like, we can actually get them to a place beyond the police, but how we do it actually matters, and that is more of a play on language and mindset than I would have said a decade ago. And I think I only have a couple. Oh, is this the last one? I think that might be the last one. Yeah. So that's the last one. Those are my pieces of advice around the podcast. I don't think that it has to be super more complicated than that, but I do think the content matters a ton. I'll tell you, there are um, a ton of things I listen to that are just a repeat of what happened in the news, and I don't think that matters as much as people think, or I think people go to news podcasts for that. I do think in the activist space, people are trying to figure out like how to align with the set of values and beliefs, and then how to understand that better, and what that means and what can be used to activate in that way. I don't think that we in the organizing space have done this super well at scale, um, but I do think it's possible. So I'll pause there. Happy to talk about anything specifically that you want to talk about. Now that I've shared sort of the things that I've learned over the past, I don't know, 8 years. And Nancy, I don't know if you're coming back. I don't know. I don't know how it goes now.
I am here. But looks like we have some questions. So feel free to take those.
Andrew said, how do you think about tapping into broader themes that might appeal to a wide audience and then bring them into the more specific work that you focus on? Yeah, I think that's right. One of the things that I say in organizing is that I got to get you in the room first. And then once you're in the room, I can actually do a lot with you. But if I don't get you in the room, it's actually really hard. So when I think about, I'll use the police stuff is that if I ask people, like, tell me, this is an activity we do in groups, is I'll say, tell me where you feel the most safe. And then they'll like get it in their mind, like, just think about it. And then I'm like, well, think about what's in the room where you feel the most safe. And they're like, okay, cool. And then I'm like, are the police there? But I'm starting from this conversation about safety and like what people need and da, da, da. I'm actually not starting from a place about the police. And I do think these big themes like the economy, healthcare, like food and shelter actually matter a ton as entrances. And then we can sort of zoom into a more specific thing. I do worry about the way we talk about them. I think that we should push people into like sort of yes or no's. So like, should everybody have access to a doctor or not? Those sort of things, and then sort of force people into places where they have to make hard choices. I do think sometimes on the left we over nuance too much, and I think that we lose in that space. But Andrew, to your push, I think yes, broader, but as an entrance. But I do think people care about the specifics, especially in their own life, more than I would have thought. Rekka, if I'm saying that right. I'm a big fan of facts and evidence, but studies show that facts don't change minds. How do you handle this? Also, your listeners mostly already the choir since podcasting is on demand. I don't know if it is true that facts and don't change minds. I do think the way we talk about facts matters. So, that $200 thing, when we talk to people about it, it matters. They're like, this is crazy. Da, da, da. The legislators are like, this is crazy. We poll on it, it works. I could ask that same felony theft question in a pretty awful, brutal way, and it would make no difference. For example, one of the things that also doesn't work is big numbers. People don't have a sense of big numbers, which is why the left talking about billionaires doesn't really work, because when you poll people, the average American doesn't know the difference between like a million or a billion. Like the big numbers don't, it feels cooler to talk about than people actually understand. So when they're like, they wasted $1 billion, like literally people don't have a concept of that. But what people do have a concept of is like the elite. And people have a concept of the haves and have-nots, the elite and non-elite in their own lives. Most people don't know billionaires. They don't know a billionaire. So I do think it's like the how we talk about the facts and evidence matters a ton. And in this moment, it is hard because there's one group of people who are lying about things, which is really hard. And I think that the storytelling work is like actual work. And I worry that we are often morally right about the issues, but morally right doesn't make it a great story. I think that, immigration is a great example where we lost the story, that the other side has painted everybody who doesn't have citizenship as somebody who jumped across the border or something crazy. And one of the things that we say to people is like, we sort of paint the other opposite. We're like, people who don't have full citizenship are people who are waiting for hearings and just didn't get a hearing yet. Is that's another way I can win if I like talk about people who sign up for hearings, they just didn't get a hearing, which is a huge part of people who don't have citizenship. We can win if that is what people think of in their mind, which is also true. That is a huge portion of the people. So how we talk about the facts and evidence, I think matters. I think the raw facts and evidence, I agree with you, don't matter as much. And then in terms of the choir, I think that, some the choir, some not the choir, but if anything, and this goes back to what I was saying about trying to get people language to use, is that we're hoping that people who listen to the podcast can turnkey it and can use it in their own communities. So I was just at Dreamville Fest in Raleigh, and a football player came up to me who's a professional football player. He comes up to me out of the blue and he's like, hey, do I listen to the podcast? And I use it when I go back into the locker room to talk to the guys about da-da-da. And it's like, that is the best of what we can do. We are hoping that people like listen to it and take some of the arguments. And we don't always agree on the podcast. Like we come at things like very differently. But we hope that from a values perspective, we actually are all aligned and that people take from one of us what they wouldn't take from the other, those sort of things. Alfredo said, content is key. It's your product, and yes, language is how you convey a narrative. Activism is how you sell it. Otherwise, it becomes temper tantrums that could be harmful, like immigration. Yeah, I think that's true. I do think the story, 10 years ago when the protest started, and I had a big platform around storytelling. I did a lot of the press for the entire space just trying to make people understand that this was a real thing. I thought storytelling was important. I didn't understand that it was like the thing. Now I'm like, oh, it's the thing. I'm like, the storytelling stuff matters a ton. That if the story is screwed, then you're screwed. I think defund is a great example of it. If we ask people, do we devote too much money to the policing communities? Should we move the money somewhere else? People say yes. They overwhelmingly say yes across race and gender, across party. People are like, cool. Um, if we use the language of defund, people are like, no. And that is a language thing. I'm willing to compromise on the language. I'm not willing to compromise on the idea. And I do think this story stuff matters a ton. In my experience, people's belief shifts when they feel part of a community, when they feel like they belong. How do you think about pushing your audience while also leaving space for new people to still feel connected and like they belong? Sort of calling in versus calling out. Um, yeah, let me answer it this way. I actually think that I think the internet sort of did something really beautiful to organizing, and I think that era is over. So I'm not a Debbie Downer about it, but I think about like when I was coming up and using Twitter. Twitter was a huge deal. Like I could tweet, be at the corner of so and so, 3,000 people come every time in St. Louis. It was a big thing. It is less of a thing in that way to mobilize people in real life today. I'm not convinced it is. I'm just not convinced it like matters the same. I think that the next part of community building and organizing, like the relationship between the two, will be helping people organize the people they know. It'll be like helping people like organize their moms and their friends and their cousins. Like I think that helping people organize hyper locally, like people say locally and they mean their neighborhood. I actually think the organizing that will bring back the left will be like me and three of my friends. It'll be like giving people like that sort of community, because I think what the internet did is that it warped people's sense of impact. It's like if you don't have 700 followers and blah 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 and da 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 1,000 likes. So I think people's sense of scale got a little warped, and I think that I think that the organizing would be hyper. It'll be like very like it'll be your people in a way that it is not today. I don't think people are going to like church basements and community centers to meet in a way they were certainly a decade ago. Haley, you said, what are some of the first asks you give your audience when inviting them to take action along with you? I've gone back and forth about this on the podcast. So Vote Save America is Crooked's like traditional organizing model. So we put people to go there to like door knock and stuff like that. So we don't make explicit asks on the podcast that are not connected to Vote Save America, just because that is the network and what we do on the network. I think when we ask people to do things, we really are focusing on like the narrative stuff. Like we're like, go talk to your mom about blah blah blah. Go see if you can convince your uncle about blah blah blah. Like that is more. I think that matters a ton. There are a lot of issues we work on at Campaign Zero they're all activist work, and sometimes our homework internally will be like call somebody else and see if you can convince them of this argument, and then we come back with the answers. Like, I think we need to normalize practicing the arguments a little bit better than I think people have done. So those, I think, are our most consistent asks of people if they're going to do something outside of themselves. George says, podcasting reaches a smaller audience than broadcasting. How effective have you found podcasts as a tool for organizing? I'm always shocked by, one of the things I think is true. I did this conversation with Brene Brown, and one of the things that she reminded me of is you don't need the masses. You just need a critical mass. Like, you need to find your people. And sometimes that is a room full of 2,000 people. Sometimes that is a room of 20 people, and like both work. So, I think we've seen everything. Like when we went on tour, we had huge crowds and da 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 da. We've also done things in very small settings with handfuls of people, which great. All of them matter. I think that what I found to be most effective is the podcast's ability to help introduce people to things they didn't know. Like literally, they hadn't thought about it before or didn't know it was a topic. Or it didn't help. Or it helped people, like it gave them language they didn't have before, like a different way of thinking about something. And those I think matter more than you'd expect, because what happens to us is that we get people's like staffers who listen to it, like the chief of staff to the so-and-so or the policy person at blah blah blah, and like those people will listen and be like, oh da da da, and then go tell their boss, and like that sort of stuff matters. in a way that I frankly didn't know was a thing until I started the podcast. Okay. Can you help podcasters with low networking connect with like-minded people? Yeah, I think the low networking connect. Yeah, I think the need for it is there. I just don't know. I get invited to a lot of organizing stuff. I know activists all over the place, and I think there is a huge group of people in the middle who are our people. I don't think we've lost the base. I think the base is still there. They don't necessarily feel at home in like an activist space, and they don't feel at home in like the Democratic Party infrastructure, whatever that looks like, but they super care. They like want to help and want to get involved and don't know what to do. And I think that that group of people is huge, and we are often trying to talk to them. Not because I don't care about the far left, but the reality is the far left, of which I consider myself somebody who came up in and still very much a part of it. The far left is going to figure it out whether they listen to my podcast or not. They generally believe like they are going to get it. And there are other places that they'll go to get messages to reinforce the things that they super believe, but they're going to get it. Just like me. I didn't listen to any podcast. They killed a kid in the middle of the street, changed my life. I think the bigger middle, though, of people who don't find a home in activist spaces or the traditional political organizing, I think that's a huge group of people. And I do think that the space is wide open, especially people of color, especially like people from marginalized identities. I think that that is like wide open. Yeah, I think it's a wide open. And I know I said this before, but there's no substitute for knowing the content. That I do think that there are a lot of vibesy things going on where it's just sort of like you don't know if the person talking to you is really informed or sort of knows how systems work or those sort of things. And I don't think that those have as much resonance with people. Yes. Oh, I wish I had a better answer to this, Rekka. Because are we have ads, and I started with Crooked 8,000 years ago. I have no clue. When I started, there weren't a lot of podcasts, certainly about race and justice, and now there are just a ton of podcasts about everything. So I don't know this as well. I obviously like Crooked. I think the other network that I would shout out is Lemonada. Lemonada, I think, is doing really great work. The CEO of Lemonada was the first producer for Pod Save the People way back in the day. So I've known her forever, and she's great. And I know they help if they believe in a podcast. They'll go help find sponsors. They've worked with a number of groups to find like nonprofit sponsors if it's not like a brandy sort of thing, like brand dash Y sort of thing. So I know that's possible, but other than those two, I don't really know. Patreon, you're right, Haley. There are some. I know more Patreons, not podcasts, but there are some really great patrons out there. I need to look at the podcasting space for Patreon, but thank you, Haley. Cool. Well, I'm always around. My email, the easiest email address is literally just Deray@Deray.com. You can't screw it up. I'm here. I think we're actually going to change the format a little bit for the podcast. When we first started, it was news. We talked about news that people didn't know. Um, and I think we're gonna like start deep diving. There are a lot of really amazing books coming out right now that I think nobody's gonna read just because don't know, they're not going to read them. They're like either sold as history books, da, da, da. And I think we're going to start doing episodes that help launch really great things into the world as opposed to just rehashing the news. When Trump was elected the first time, we essentially had like a no Trump rule on the podcast, not because we didn't care or we didn't think that Trump mattered to people of color or our base, but because every podcast in the space was talking about Trump all day long, and we wanted to help people understand like the other things that were happening in the world. We obviously can't do that this go round because the world is even crazier than it was um, first go round. But I say that to say that like we're even interested in like what format changes we can do given that the world is changing.
Okay, hopping back in here, I see. Oh, it looks like you have something else coming in the chat.
No, I like that, Rick, as a format. Yeah, I think it, and you'd be shocked. I don't know how many of you have participated in the legislative process locally, but let me tell you, even our favorite legislators don't know any content. Like, they literally don't know. And they won't tell you they don't know because it just doesn't look good. Um, so if you can, like, help if it's a podcast episode that they can listen to, you get experts to talk about something, like all that stuff matters because people really don't know the content and have a little bit of shame around it. And podcasts, blogs, like they have been huge deals. Oh, listener to an activist. Oh, so many teachers, Haley. Like it's so cool. Every time a teacher writes us, they're like, "Oh, it's really cool." Um, we have people who, especially around the holidays, who will say they used something they heard on the podcast to to like talk to their family about, or they like use something they learned on the podcast to like tell like to teach their friends about an issue, or to push back on a thing, or demystify a thing. So we get a lot. That is mostly what we get, and we don't take it personal. People either like all three of us sort of talking together, or they really like one person. So we'll get mail from listeners. It's like Miles really da 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 da, and that was so great, and that's great too. Like that, we all approach it really differently. So I am an activist in a more traditional sense. Kaya, who just left the podcast, she was a superintendent of DC public schools for a decade, and then Miles didn't go to college, is self-taught, incredible writer, incredible theorist. And I wanted, when I got people together, I wanted there to be a range of experiences so people could see same values, different experiences. Kai is now off the pod, and Sharonda, who runs Education Leaders of Color, and she was a teacher and organizer. She is sort of the other, she's the other person who anchors it, and we all like again values align but very very different experiences, and that matters because sometimes they'll say things and I'm like, I don't know, like we disagreed about something the other day, and I'm like, Miles, I hear you, good speech, like the words were cool, but like no, I'm not there. And Kaya was older than us, and we were Miles will call her Auntie Kaya, and it was cool to just like hear the back and forth of like, yeah, it's cool being on it because I'm like, I don't know what they're gonna say before we record, and it does. It's always interesting. Cool. Yeah, but my email's in. I'll put it in again. It's very hard to screw up because, yeah, cool. Well, Nancy, this is great. Yep, Alfredo, we don't disagree. I think that there are better ways that we could message. The only thing I can say is our base is still there. I don't think we've lost the base. I think that the storytelling is off, but I think the base is there. Cool. Thank you. Thank you, Nancy. We did it. You're on mute.
Of course, because it's Monday. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you truly enjoyed this time with DeRay. Make sure to write down his email. And this webinar will be recorded and you'll be able to see it in our previously recorded events. So thank you all for showing up. We'll
See
see
you
you next time.
later.